Lord, help me make something out of nuttin' again.
It is the last week of January in a little southern mill town. The rent is due on Friday, the wind is whistling through the windows, and there is not much left in the cupboards. But southern grandmas knew how to turn a bag of beans, a bit of cornmeal, and whatever scraps were left into steaming suppers that kept everyone warm and full. Today, we are stepping into those rent-week kitchens to look at 25 rent-week winter suppers southern grandmas threw together when there was more month than money. Scalloped tomatoes. Scalloped tomatoes might sound like something from your great-grandmother's Depression cookbook, but in the 1970s, it was reborn as comfort food with flair. Canned stewed tomatoes were mixed with cubes of white bread, plenty of butter, sugar, salt, and a dash of black pepper, then baked in a Pyrex dish until bubbling and golden. The smell alone could fill a house with warmth, sweet, tangy, and buttery all at once. Magazines like Family Circle called it the forgotten cousin of stuffing, and they were right. Housewives loved it because it rescued stale bread and turned it into something that tasted like home. Some added a shake of Parmesan for extra sophistication, and others mixed in a bit of onion for bite. Served in a daisy-patterned casserole dish, it looked right at home on any avocado countertop. And when it hit the table beside fried chicken or meatloaf, everyone knew to head straight for the crispy corners. The best part, always claimed by whoever got there first, scalloped corn. Scalloped corn was the humble sidekick that showed up next to nearly every Sunday roast of the decade. It was part casserole, part pudding, a creamy blend of canned corn, eggs, milk, crushed saltines, and a good pat of butter on top. When it baked, the edges puffed and browned, giving off that sweet, toasty smell you could follow from the living room. Housewives loved it because it stretched a single can of corn into something that fed the whole family. The Betty Crocker Picture Cookbook called it a reliable favorite, which was the 1970s way of saying it never failed. Some cooks added diced green peppers or a pinch of sugar. Others kept it simple and let the corn shine. Served in a butter-yellow Pyrex dish, it was the kind of comfort food that didn't need fanfare. Everyone knew exactly what it was and exactly how good it would taste. And somehow, that familiarity made it special. Broccoli rice casserole. Before casserole became a word people whispered apologetically, broccoli rice casserole was a badge of pride. Made with instant rice, frozen broccoli, a can of cream of mushroom soup, and a fistful of shredded cheddar, it hit every note of the 1970s flavor symphony. Some home cooks swore by adding crushed cornflakes on top. Others preferred buttery breadcrumbs. But everyone agreed it belonged at Thanksgiving, Christmas, and every potluck in between. The Campbell's Kitchen Classics series promoted it as a modern vegetable bake, and they weren't kidding. It was quick, cheap, and deeply comforting. When you opened the oven, a wave of creamy, cheesy steam rolled out, and the smell alone could make kids forget they were about to eat broccoli. Served on Corelle plates with those orange flowers around the rim, it was both homely and elegant in its own way, the edible definition of home. Lima bean casserole. If there was one dish that proved a 1970s cook could turn anything into comfort food, it was the lima bean casserole. Lima beans didn't have many fans, but toss them with cream of celery soup, diced onions, a little bacon, and a crunchy breadcrumb topping, and you had a miracle on your hands. The Farm Journal Country Cookbook promoted it as a hearty side with old-fashioned value, and that was enough to make it a hit in households trying to stretch a dollar. Some homemakers added cheese to mellow the flavor, others folded in chopped pimentos for color. It baked into something surprisingly rich. The beans soft, the sauce velvety, and the top golden. When it came bubbling out of the oven, you could almost forget how much the kids claimed to hate lima beans. The smell alone, earthy, buttery, and a little smoky, could win over even the skeptics. On avocado green Corelle plates, it didn't look glamorous, but it tasted like the kind of home cooking you can't fake. Baked macaroni and tomatoes. Before the era of boxed macaroni and cheese dominance, families made baked macaroni and tomatoes. A dish that managed to feel both thrifty and hearty. Elbow noodles, canned tomatoes, butter, and a dash of sugar were baked together until the edges crisped and the noodles soaked up every bit of tomato flavor. Many cooks added a handful of shredded cheddar or a dusting of breadcrumbs to give it some body. It was a staple in old Better Homes and Gardens editions, sitting proudly between the goulash and scalloped potatoes sections. The smell that filled the kitchen was something between tomato soup and grilled cheese. Simple, nostalgic, and impossible to mistake. Kids might not have cheered when they saw it, but by the second bite, everyone was quiet and content. It was the ultimate make something from nothing side dish, the kind of comfort that didn't need to impress anyone but did anyway. Zucchini casserole. When backyard gardens exploded with zucchini, 1970s cooks fought back with casserole. Thin sliced squash met onions, breadcrumbs, eggs, and a generous handful of cheddar, bound together with condensed soup. The era's favorite glue. Family Circle called it the vegetable everyone can love, and that was mostly true once the cheese melted through. The dish baked until the top browned and the kitchen smelled like buttered toast. Many added a dash of Italian seasoning to feel worldly. Others stuck with salt, pepper, and love. Served in a speckled enamel pan, it was summer comfort at its peak. A way to turn garden excess into something everyone fought over. You could almost see the casserole sweating on the counter while the cicadas buzzed outside. One bite and you remembered how good simple vegetables tasted when the goal wasn't health, just supper. Cabbage au gratin. Before kale claimed the spotlight, cabbage had its 15 minutes in bubbling cheese. Cabbage au gratin sounded French, which was half the appeal. Housewives parboiled wedges of cabbage, tucked them into a casserole, poured over a sauce made from condensed cheddar soup or bechamel, and topped it with breadcrumbs. It emerged golden, fragrant, and far more elegant than anyone expected. Cookbooks promised it would convert cabbage doubters, and sometimes it did. The cabbage softened just enough to soak up the sauce, the edges caramelized, and the top formed a crispy crown. Served beside baked ham or pork chops, it felt surprisingly refined for a weeknight. In an age when every dish needed a little drama, this one delivered without breaking the grocery budget. Proof that even cabbage could strut. Creamed onions. Creamed onions were a holiday classic in the 1970s. The side dish that looked humble but carried the scent of celebration. Whole pearl onions, usually from a jar or the frozen section, were simmered in butter until glossy, then folded into a sauce of milk, flour, and nutmeg. Magazines called it a dish of quiet elegance, and they were right. Served in a Corningware casserole beside roast turkey or glazed ham, it brought an old-world feel to every modern kitchen. The sauce thickened just enough to coat each onion like ivory pearls in velvet. A sprinkle of paprika on top gave it that signature 70s presentation flair. When you lifted the lid, steam rushed out, carrying a scent halfway between creamed corn and Sunday dinner. Molasses biscuits with hot butter. There was something about December that made molasses taste richer, almost like it thickened on purpose, so you had to coax it out with a spoon. Old Southern kitchens always had a jar of statins tucked beside the flour, and when mornings turned frosty, Mama would mix a quick batch of biscuits that came out tall, soft, and steaming hot. These weren't dainty biscuits either. They were big enough to cradle in both hands, perfect for soaking up a glossy drizzle of molasses as soon as they hit the plate. The smell drifted through the house and let everyone know breakfast was ready long before the table was set. Butter melted the second it touched the top, leaving little golden streaks that ran down the sides like warm stripes. Kids loved how molasses pooled into the cracks, turning each bite into a sticky, sweet memory. And while it wasn't a holiday dish exactly, it felt like one during December because molasses had that deep, old-time warmth people leaned on when the weather turned sharp. These biscuits were more than breakfast. They were fuel for the day ahead, whether that meant school, chores, or bundling up to check on the animals before sunrise. Country ham scraps with red-eye gravy on bread. December was prime time for ham scraps because families were forever slicing off a bit here and there from the big holiday ham stored in the icebox. Nothing went to waste, especially the pieces that were too salty or too irregular to serve to company. Those bits were chopped and tossed into a skillet with just enough grease to make them sizzle. Once they crisped up, Mama would pour in a splash of yesterday's strong black coffee, the kind that could wake the dead, and scrape up every browned piece stuck to the bottom. That's how red-eye gravy was born, thin, smoky, sharp, and unforgettable. She would ladle it over thick slices of bread, usually whatever loaf was closest to going stale, and the whole thing would soak up the gravy like a sponge. The smell alone could bring people to the kitchen half awake. This breakfast had a way of sticking with you, giving you enough energy to face cold porches and chilly farmyards. It was humble, yes, but in December it tasted like a southern version of holiday comfort. Hot cornmeal mush with cane syrup. When mornings were so cold the windows held their breath in frost, cornmeal mush was the quickest way to warm up a kitchen. Families kept cornmeal in lard tins or big paper sacks, and a scoop whisked into boiling water created a thick, velvety porridge. December made it taste even better because there was something companionable about stirring a pot while the rest of the house woke up slow. Once it reached the perfect thickness, Mama poured it into bowls and let a ribbon of cane syrup swirl across the top. Kids would drag their spoons through the syrup, making patterns until the whole bowl turned a warm amber color. Sometimes it was eaten as is, other times it was poured into a loaf pan, left to cool, and sliced to fry for tomorrow's breakfast. Either way, it was simple but deeply satisfying, the sort of food that lived at the crossroads of frugality and comfort. And in December, when grocery trips were fewer and the weather cut through your coat, cornmeal mush felt like a warm handshake with the past. Sausage patties with tomato rice. Tomato rice might not sound like a breakfast dish to folks today, but in plenty of southern homes during December, it was a regular sight on the table. It often started the night before when leftover rice sat in a simple Pyrex dish in the icebox, waiting to be revived into something better than it had any right to be. Mama would fry up sausage patties first, letting the skillet gather those browned, savory bits that make a kitchen smell like home. Then she stirred in tomatoes, sometimes canned, sometimes fresh from a summer harvest, until the rice turned a cheerful red. The sausage patties went right on top, soaking in flavor without ever losing their crisp edges. Kids thought the dish looked like Christmas colors on a plate, and grown-ups loved that it filled everyone up without dipping too deeply into the grocery budget. December mornings made the whole routine feel especially comforting, because the warmth rising from the bowl hit you before you even took the first bite. The tang of tomato, the richness of the sausage, and the softness of the rice came together in a way that felt like a quiet celebration. It carried families through long, cold days with the kind of steady comfort that sticks with you years later. Cornbread and buttermilk. Cornbread and buttermilk is one of those breakfasts that older Southerners talk about with a certain kind of fondness, the kind reserved for meals that were simple but dependable. During December, when mornings could be sharp enough to nudge everyone closer to the stove, this quick breakfast was a lifesaver. Leftover cornbread sat on the counter wrapped in a dish towel, waiting to be crumbled into a tall glass or a bowl. Buttermilk poured over it in a slow, steady stream that softened the crumbs without turning them mushy too fast. The first spoonful always surprised you with its coolness, followed by that tangy, almost earthy flavor that stuck with you longer than you would think. Some folks added a little sugar, others insisted that ruined the whole point. Kids learned early to appreciate the quiet power of this meal. It kept you full, kept you steady, and kept you warm once the chores started. It was the kind of breakfast you could throw together even on mornings when everyone overslept or the kitchen felt too cold to linger in. Hoe cakes with country butter. Hoe cakes are one of those southern staples that show up across generations, but December gave them a little extra charm. The batter came together quickly, just cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt, and hit the skillet with a satisfying hiss. They browned fast, leaving a crisp outer layer and a tender center that held the heat beautifully. Country butter softened the moment it touched the surface, running into all the little nooks like it had been waiting for this exact moment. The smell of hoe cakes frying filled the kitchen in a way that made everyone drift toward the stove, especially on cold mornings when you could feel the chill through the floorboards. Kids liked stacking them like pancakes, while grown-ups folded them in half and ate them with their hands. December breakfasts like this weren't about fuss, they were about getting something warm and substantial into everyone before school, chores, or long morning drives. And the simplicity of hoe cakes made them a quiet kind of comfort, especially when paired with a warm mug and the sound of the radio humming in the background. Hominy with a bit of bacon grease. Hominy was one of those old-fashioned breakfasts that tasted different depending on who made it, but in December it took on a deeper, heartier flavor. Canned or dried, it didn't matter. Once it hit the stove with a spoonful of bacon grease, the transformation felt almost magical. The kernels soaked up the smoky richness, softening without losing their shape, creating a bowl of warm comfort that seemed to glow from the inside. The smell drifted through the house in a slow wave, inviting anyone still in bed to come shuffle toward the kitchen. Some families added a pinch of salt, others stirred in a little butter. But everyone agreed that bacon grease was the star of the show. December made breakfast like this feel more necessary, especially on cold mornings when the house took its time warming up. Kids often didn't think much of hominy at first, but once they tasted it alongside a slice of toast or crisp bacon, they understood why it had lasted through so many generations. It wasn't flashy or festive, but it had a quiet strength to it. The kind of breakfast that prepared you for a long day of school, work, or holiday errands. And in the middle of winter, that was worth its weight in gold. Cornmeal fried oysters on toast. In coastal southern towns and some low-country kitchens, December was oyster season, and that meant breakfast sometimes felt a little more special. Fresh oysters, cold from winter waters, were dusted lightly in cornmeal and fried until they reached a perfect golden brown. They popped and sizzled in the skillet, sending up a scent that made the whole kitchen feel like a holiday morning. Toast waited nearby, usually thick cut and buttered, ready to soak up whatever juices escaped the oysters. Some families added a squeeze of lemon, others kept it plain, trusting the sea salt flavor to do the work. Cornmeal created a gentle crunch that played beautifully against the soft center of each oyster. December breakfasts like this were not everyday fare. They were tied to seasons, traditions, and whatever the fishermen brought back to shore. Kids often approached them with curiosity, but one bite usually won them over. And for adults, it was a reminder that winter had its own kind of bounty, even when the garden lay bare. Bacon grease corn cakes with holiday spices. Corn cakes made with bacon grease already had their own loyal following, but December brought a little twist that made them feel more festive. Mama would add a pinch of cinnamon or clove, nothing too strong, just enough to give the batter a warm, almost holiday-like aroma. The bacon grease made the edges crisp up in the skillet, while the inside stayed tender and wonderfully warm. As they cooked, the kitchen filled with a scent that mixed everyday Southern cooking with hints of Christmas baking, and that combination made the whole house feel cozier. Kids loved seeing the cakes puff up as they browned, especially when the first one hit the plate with a small hissing sigh of steam. A pat of butter went on top, melting into little golden rivulets that carried the spices across every bite. Some households drizzled on a little syrup, others served them plain, letting the bacon and spice speak for themselves. December mornings gave this simple dish a special charm because it took something familiar and dressed it up just enough for the season. Creamed chipped beef on toast, affectionately known in many households by a name I can't say on this family-friendly channel. But despite its crude nickname, this dish was pure comfort food gold. Grandma would tear open that little glass jar or pouch of dried beef, the kind that always smelled salty and smoky even before it hit the pan. She'd snip the slices into thin ribbons with her kitchen scissors, the ones that rattled a little because the screw holding them together had loosened over the years. Butter would melt in the skillet, filling the room with a soft, nutty aroma that signaled the beginning of something good. Then came the flour, sprinkled with the confidence of a woman who didn't need measuring cups because her hands were the measuring cups. As she whisked in the milk, the mixture thickened slowly, and she could always tell exactly when it was ready just by how it clung to the spoon. The dried beef went in next, turning the pale sauce into a speckled pink and cream mixture that somehow tasted richer than the sum of its parts. Toast popped up from the old toaster, often a little unevenly browned, but nobody complained because this was Christmas Eve supper, and everyone knew to be grateful. When the sauce was ladled over the toast, it softened just enough to make every bite cozy without getting soggy. It wasn't fancy, but it carried the warmth of a dish handed down through hard times, military kitchens, and frugal households. Bean soup. And this wasn't just any bean soup. Grandma would start with the cheapest dried beans she could find, usually navy beans or pintos, and she'd soak them overnight. In the morning, she'd drain them and tip them into the biggest pot she owned, the one with the enamel chipping off the handle, but still going strong after 20 years. If she was lucky enough to get a leftover ham bone from the butcher for a few cents, she'd drop it in with a kind of reverence, knowing it would flavor the entire pot. If not, she'd use a scrap of salt pork or even just a spoonful of bacon grease, because she understood better than anyone how far a little seasoning could go. As the pot simmered throughout the day, the scent of beans, pork, and onions drifted through the whole house, settling into the walls like a memory that would never fade. She'd check the pot every hour, giving it a gentle stir with a wooden spoon worn smooth from decades of use. Carrots or celery made it in if they were around. But the beauty of this soup was its simplicity. By late afternoon, the beans had softened into creamy perfection, and the ham bone, if she had one, released every bit of flavor it had left to offer. When she ladled the soup into bowls, it felt hearty enough to quiet even the hungriest stomach. Milk toast, which sounds incredibly simple but was actually quite beloved. Grandma would toast slices of bread until they reached just the right shade of brown, often with uneven spots because the old toaster had a mind of its own. While the bread toasted, she warmed milk on the stove, stirring it patiently so it never scorched. She'd add a hint of vanilla if she had any left, or maybe a sprinkle of cinnamon or nutmeg to make it feel more festive. The scent rising from that pot had a way of settling nerves and quieting squabbles, especially on a busy holiday evening. Once the toast was ready, she'd place the slices in shallow bowls and pour the warm milk over them, letting it soak just enough to soften the bread without turning it to mush. The first bite was always comforting, warm, and familiar, like the culinary equivalent of being wrapped in a quilt. For children, it felt like a treat, something different from the usual dinners and simple enough that even picky eaters welcomed it. Adults appreciated it too, especially when the budget was stretched thin and something gentle felt just right. Liver and onions. Liver was incredibly cheap in the 60s and 70s because most people didn't know how to cook it properly, but your grandmother did. She knew the secret to making liver tender rather than bitter, and it started with soaking the slices in milk until they mellowed out. She'd dry them carefully, dredge them lightly in flour, and heat the frying pan until it was just right. The onions would go in first, sliced into long ribbons that softened and caramelized as they cooked, giving off a sweet aroma that filled the whole kitchen. Once the onions were golden, she'd push them aside and add the liver, searing each piece quickly so it stayed tender. The sizzling sound signaled that supper was well on its way, even if the ingredients looked humble. She knew exactly how long to cook each slice, never leaving it long enough to get tough. When everything was finished, she'd pile the onions back on top, letting their sweetness mingle with the savory flavor of the liver. Served with mashed potatoes made from whatever tubers were left in the bin, the meal felt hearty and satisfying. This dish reminded everyone that even the most economical ingredients could come together into something warm, filling, and full of the quiet confidence of a home cook who knew her craft. Pork and beans. But these weren't straight from a can. Grandma always started with dried beans because they cost pennies and could feed the entire family with leftovers for days. She'd rinse them until the water ran clear, then set them to simmer with the cheapest pork she could find, often just fatty bacon ends or a small piece of salt pork. The scent of beans slowly softening in the pot would drift through the kitchen, mingling with the rich aroma of pork breaking down into tender bits. She might add onions, a spoonful of brown sugar, or a drizzle of molasses if there happened to be some left from baking. Every addition was deliberate, measured not in cups but in instinct. The pot would bubble on the back burner all afternoon, giving the beans time to absorb every flavor. She stirred the pot occasionally, listening to the soft, thick sound that told her the dish was coming together. By the time the sun set, the beans had transformed into something rich and hearty, a dish that filled the stomach and warmed the spirit. Served with slices of cornbread or leftover rolls, it felt like a feast made entirely from leftovers and know-how. This dish would feed a crowd for very little money. Cabbage rolls. And these were a masterclass in stretching ground meat. Grandma would blanch the cabbage leaves first, dropping them into boiling water until they softened just enough to fold without tearing. The kitchen filled with steam that fogged up her glasses, but she never missed a beat. In a mixing bowl, she combined the cheapest ground meat she could afford with cooked rice, chopped onions, and seasonings she'd measured by feel rather than by spoon. The filling was humble, but she knew exactly how to coax big flavor from small amounts. Each cabbage leaf was spooned with a modest portion of the mixture, then rolled tightly and tucked like a tiny green package. She'd line them up in a baking dish, fitting them snugly so they held their shape. A sauce made from canned tomatoes or leftover tomato juice was poured over the top, adding acidity that balanced the richness of the meat and rice. The tray baked slowly, filling the house with an aroma that felt comforting and slightly tangy. By the time they were done, the cabbage was tender, the filling was savory, and the sauce had thickened into something that begged to be spooned over mashed potatoes, tomato soup, and grilled cheese. This wasn't just a meal. It was a small moment of comfort in a season when money ran thin, but love still ran deep. Your grandmother would pull out a can of tomato soup from the pantry, often Campbell's because it was cheap, reliable, and always tucked behind the flour or sugar. She'd whisk it together with water or milk, depending on what she had left in the fridge, stirring it patiently until it warmed into that familiar rosy color that felt like a hug in a bowl. The aroma drifting from the pot was simple but irresistible, a mix of tangy tomatoes and gentle warmth that signaled supper was nearly ready. She'd butter the bread with practiced speed, never wasting a drop, and lay each sandwich in the skillet where it sizzled softly as it browned. She'd press each sandwich gently with her spatula, ensuring the cheese melted into a smooth, gooey layer that glued the whole thing together. When she sliced the sandwiches on the diagonal, it felt like a tiny holiday ritual, revealing the melted cheese stretching slightly at the cut. Paired with the warm, steaming soup, the combination was somehow simple and magical all at once. It was a meal that filled bellies without emptying wallets, a supper that made the kitchen feel cozy even if the weather outside wasn't cooperating. Chicken and dumplings. But the chicken was usually just the cheapest parts your grandmother could buy, often necks, backs, and wings. She'd simmer these bony pieces for hours to make a rich stock, then remove the bones and shred any meat that came off. The dumplings were made from simple flour, baking powder, and milk, dropped by spoonfuls into the simmering broth. The result was an incredibly comforting, soul-warming meal that felt like a warm hug, shepherd's pie, which was the ultimate way to stretch a small amount of meat into a full meal. Your grandmother would brown whatever ground meat she could afford, add some onions and whatever vegetables she had on hand, then top it with mashed potatoes made from potatoes that might have been getting a little soft. The whole thing would go into the oven until the potato topping was golden and crispy. The contrast between the savory meat filling and the creamy potato topping was pure comfort food perfection. When she finally served it, each scoop revealed warm layers of meat, vegetables, and creamy potatoes nestled together. A true reflection of making the best of what you had. Pancakes for dinner. Which might sound strange, but was actually quite special. Your grandmother would make pancakes using flour, eggs, milk, and a little baking powder. Maybe she'd add a tiny bit of vanilla to the batter, or serve them with homemade syrup made from brown sugar and water. Sometimes she'd even add bits of apple if she had any, or make them extra thin like crepes pancakes for dinner. Felt special and different, and they were incredibly economical to make. Christmas Eve meatballs. Christmas Eve meatballs were your grandmother's way of making a pound of ground meat feed a table full of hungry faces. She'd combine the meat with breadcrumbs, eggs, and onions, adding just enough seasoning to bring the mixture to life. To stretch the meat further, she often added oatmeal or crushed saltine crackers, which absorbed flavor beautifully and kept the meatballs tender. She shaped each meatball with care, rolling them between her palms until they were smooth and perfectly sized. In the skillet, they sizzled softly as they browned, scattering the kitchen with an irresistible savory scent that made everyone eager for supper. Once browned, the meatballs went into a pot of tomato sauce or brown gravy, depending on what ingredients she had on hand. They simmered slowly, absorbing the flavors of the sauce while becoming even more tender. She'd often serve them over rice or noodles, both inexpensive options that helped stretch the meal even further. Every forkful offered a comforting mix of savory meat and warm, seasoned sauce. Even though the ingredients were simple, the meatballs tasted like something that took much more effort and expense. French toast. And finally, French toast. But this wasn't breakfast food, this was dinner, and it was made from bread that was getting stale and would otherwise be thrown away. Your grandmother would whisk together eggs and milk, dip thick slices of day-old bread in the mixture, and cook them in a buttered pan until golden brown. She'd often add a tiny bit of vanilla to the egg mixture, or sprinkle the finished toast with cinnamon and sugar if she had it. Sometimes she'd serve it with homemade syrup or even just butter and a dusting of powdered sugar. The bread would be crispy outside and custardy inside, and somehow this simple dish made from ingredients that cost almost nothing felt more special and memorable than any expensive meal. It is funny how those rent-week suppers, thrown together when there was hardly anything in the house, turned into the meals we remember most. If your family had a make-something out of nut and night, tell about it in the comments so we can all peek inside your grandma's kitchen too. Thank you for spending a little time here today, and if this brought back a memory, feel free to share it with someone who stood beside you at that old stove.